not curators, but three museum professionals, directors, curators, just to give a little taste at the end of this session of what their museums have been doing in terms of addressing the colonial, and to open that for a discussion. Each presenter, each person will have, if you don't mind, you can just speak openly for no more than a few minutes, yeah, to put out a question or a proposition that you have, and then after that we'll go into a conversation. So, Claudia, should I ask you to start?
Okay, so we are going, most of you know that our museum is closed now for renovation, and in next year, in October, we will reopen our permanent galleries. And from the beginning, it was very clear that in these 14 galleries, we want to have one gallery focusing on colonialism. And together with my colleagues, I was working on the concept, and I can tell you it is very difficult to decide how to do this gallery. And I think I wrote 4 concepts before I satisfied my director, Steven Engelsmann, and our former chief curator, Barbara Plankensteiner, who said, okay, fine, now you can go this way. And the concept we decided to really make was that half of the gallery is dealing with the colonial past of our collections, and if they are contaminated with colonial mind and history. And to do this, we start with the question, has Austria something to do with colonialism? Because the majority of Austrians believe that they have nothing to do with this concept. Yeah, it's totally out of their experience. But for me, it was very important not only to talk about the past, but also about our colonial present. Because I agree with Wayne that our museums are still colonial places. And that when we are dealing with the colonial past, then it makes, for me, the most sense when we are discussing our own museum practice and how we can change it to decolonize the ethnographic museum, which is, well, we are on the way. We do it in, for example, I'm discussing with myself and together with Sally and Richard Price, collecting practice about amongst the Samaka in Suriname, where I did a collecting trip in 2005, and that was a really colonial project. Yeah? I found myself in a colonial situation of inequality, of power inequality, economic inequality, where the museum was the institution who benefit from this situation with a beautiful and nice collection. So I think we have to tell the hard truth even on our own work and not only about our ancestor in the museum. And well, I think, yeah, that's for the moment.
Thank you, thank you. As Nick gave a long talk last night, I'll leave him for last and ask Bruno to
okay, thank you. I would say exactly the same as in Vienna, with this one difference. From the beginning, it was not clear to have a room on colonial history in the new Museum of Tervuren, and it was only after a peer review in 2013 that the reviewers for the new exhibition layout said, but where is your story on the colonial history? And the answer was, and it was an honest answer, we will tell this story all over. And we said, no, 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 you should have a specific place for that. I was part of that peer review committee, and then just 1 year ago started working at the museum, and I now understand very well why there was no room for colonial history, because it is a very, very problematic room to make. Between us, we have lost engagement of our chief historian in the museum for this room, because what she made and what the comment was not compatible. Other historians had fierce opinions but did not dare to express their opinions on what should be there openly, or even openly within the museum. And also the museologists said that we do not have enough collections to tell the story in a true sense. We did a lot of engagement with people from African communities, and their agenda was an agenda of telling a political story which was confronted with the lack of objects that we have. So they say, you should tell about this, but then we said, we don't have any archives, or so we cannot tell about this with our collection. So it is a very, very problematic issue, which we try to solve now. A very scientific way. We make another peer review panel, and we invite some professors to help us in getting the things. And one of the professors said, well, it's a very simple thing, just stick to the facts. That was a historian professor. History. And I said, yeah, but what facts? And also, and thinking of it, seeing this work of art, Speak No Evil, there is a danger that Verbergt of University of Ghent points to, that not to fall with making a dedicated room to the history of colonial history, to go into this idea that the past is evil and evil is past. That what has done, oh, we're sorry for that, it was a past, but luckily now it is not there anymore. So that's where enters the decolonization challenge. And I would like to use 1 minute just as a test. This is our draft of what we think that decolonization in the museum should be. And it's a test with all the academic speakers before that say what it should be. Here we go. Decolonization, we say, is a process in which not only facts about past and contemporary Africa are described and shown as part of a history or specific society, but also it is a process in which the construction of meaning and sense-giving is stripped of all its colonial mechanisms. In that sense, it is a similar process as the avoidance of ethnocentrism or Eurocentrism. But then what we felt we had to add is this, and this I didn't hear this morning, it is that new constructs that replace the colonial ones are rooted in the paradigms that give a central role to superdiversity, globalization, and multipolarity. We hereby do not underestimate European values and traditions, nor do we think that the ethical judgments should have no ground in the European principles, European in between brackets, of democracy, humanism, and enlightenment. At stake is to ban sneaking and undisclosed mechanisms of exclusions, inequality, and racism. And now we specifically say how we are going to do it, for instance, by having a critical and apt attitude with respect to the own history of the museum, with respect to the role of King Leopold II, but with respect towards African victims of colonial violence. We have in the museum a statute for the Belgian victims of colonization, but not of African victims, so far, and have an open attitude towards restitution matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Nick, for that last couple of minutes.
I think some people here have probably heard me say several times that I think it's hugely important that we treat ethnographic collections as history collections. I want to qualify and complicate that broader view briefly here. There have been many rich projects in Cambridge. My colleague Anita Hurley did a Fiji exhibition very much about the formation of one of our key founding collections in the context of early colonial administration. We have a sort of upcoming project, so let me just present you with a problem. Quite a few people here are probably aware that there's been a Cambridge University student campaign to repatriate a Benin bronze object that's not in the museum I work at, but in one of the colleges. But in that context, we're looking to redisplay our Benin material in a question-raising way, and one of the components of that display might be a single case that explains the context and the story of 1897, presumably the single most notorious incident of looting and the whole sort of scramble for African art, a context that wasn't explained, for example, in the BM Africa galleries that Ruth pointed out in a review of those galleries 15 years ago, I think. It struck me that one of the ways of doing that would be of talking not only about the history, but about the contention about that history in the present would be through a series of quotations. People who are very clear that something belongs where it belongs. There's a prominent British museum director who said not so long ago that repatriation is yesterday's question. There's a prominent member of the Benin court who says if somebody has stolen my car, he has to return it to me, and it's not his business whether I have a good garage to keep it in. And one of the reasons, I mean, I think in some ways that this is a sort of positive approach, but I'm also worried in a way that people might come into that display and just sort of agree with the quotations that they already agree with and go away again. Because, of course, when we're engaging with these issues with students, I mean, we're trying to complicate those received views so that if a student is very clear that this belongs in one place, or if for her the question is simply where does this belong, what we want her to think about is that the first and last question you have to ask about this object. You know, what other questions are there and what are the implications of the questions you ask? The Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology was the largest lender to Tate Britain's Artist and Empire exhibition, and I mean, not by ourselves, but we actually supplied sort of most of the cross-cultural material in that exhibition. And I think one of the things we really want to be thinking about more is not just what we do in our own spaces and contexts, but what we can do in partnership with other kinds of museums, and are there ways we can try and get them to accept our interventions in their spaces. We talk a lot about artists' interventions, but maybe there's scope for sort of cross-generic and cross-disciplinary curatorial interventions in, for example, the mainstream art museum. And so I've said, yes, we must, it's hugely important that we foreground colonial histories and the issues that they raise in the present. But I think it's also important to say not all the time. Because if in an art museum, it's perfectly okay to have a very focused display about Spanish religious painting from the mid-17th century. And if the movement in world cultures museums gets sort of pushed towards doing themes like hair or body art that are of attract wider publics, are we saying then that, you know, we don't want to do an exhibition about Memoyer, or we can't do an exhibition about the first 2 years of Papunya painting? Are we saying that those sort of very specific topics that might in a way sound the contexts of very traditional sort of museum exhibitions are no longer relevant or appropriate? And I think it's a huge problem if we are saying that, because that's in a way saying, again, these places are too small and far away to warrant that sort of depth of serious representation and treatment.
Okay. All right, thank you, Nick. I mean, what is the conceptual frame within which you, or through which you exhibit the colonial, which is what Claudia referred to in the beginning? And I've always said to Guido that I would never want his job. Of course, I'd want a job like his, but not his job in specific, because the question of how one displays the colonial in the present is such a mammoth task. Not for us and for Terfura, it might be so that you dedicate one room. And I would ask the question if it should be one room. But for a museum like yours that is so invested in the colonial past, can you do it right? I always ask Guido. So to actually acknowledge that one is failed before one starts is good, sometimes I think. I open to the audience for questions, and I have a few that I'd like to come back to. So any questions? And to steal one mic. Yeah. And please, there has to be... Oh, good. Thank you, Peter.
Very quickly, I think we're all very interested what is going to happen in Tervuren, of course. It's such an enormous challenge. I was worried by what you added. You read out what decolonization, and then there was a kind of statement. It was very heavy. I couldn't handle it so quickly, but it sounded extremely reassuring to me. A kind of don't worry, something like that. And I think I agree with what the other said. You can only do some things there right. Well, probably you can never do it right, but you can only do it right if it's worrying. I mean, you should give a shock to people. You should worry people. And I was worried what I heard so quickly that it gives a kind of luckily feeling, and then you've lost. Then you're lost. If some people go out happily of that room, there's a problem, I think. But it went so quickly.
So the question you're asking is the intention to ensure that people come out with a good feeling, you know, rather than a troubled, questioning feeling about the past and the present and whatever. What? Yeah. Yeah. No. I'm asking. So yes. Yeah. Bruno. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, what I read is a kind of guideline that we needed for ourselves, and not only for this room, but for the whole museum. But the question, of course, is who should come out, with what opinions should you come out? It is not so, it is really a very messy thing. It is, of course, we can say, oh, we want to make like any filmmaker or theater maker that says, well, I want to make a play, and then when people come out, they really have to think on and reflect on what happened. But then, is it only the people that, are we doing this for, let's say, people like us that are completely convinced, and finally Tervuren comes out and saying that the colonial past is evil, and that even till today it is evil, and that till today or is it, or should we please, and let me give, in this peer panel, we have, so we do have a panel of people from African societies living in Belgium, and then we decided we're going to ask professor of university at University of Kinshasa, as seen as a consensual figure, a high authority figure on history of his country. And in fact, his critique on what we were saying is you're neglecting too many of the positive effects of the history during colonial times. I mean, he was saying something that we dare not to say. And he said, you're neglecting the fact that our country gained a lot in infrastructure during colonial times. And it is, so we're much more even now in what to show, what to tell, what are the facts, stick to the facts. Is this a fact that infrastructure has been tremendously improved during colonial times, or how important is that fact to show, and how reassuring is this to the people that will visit the room on colonial history?
But I would say it's very important that it's not only about perpetrators and victims. The colonial relationship is very, very complicated. So it's not just giving the Belgians a bad idea and making the Africans happy or whatever. I think it's bringing out all the complicities and all the connivance.
I think that in our room, I don't hope that the visitor is leaving it shocked. But when they are leaving the room and they just said, oh wow, that's complicated, then I'm happy.
Stephen, and then Barbara.
I wanted to say something because Claudia has already addressed this discussion between us about what the colonialism gallery should be about. And well, I think you've just given the answer. It is a very complex issue. It's been debated and discussed in with all sorts of perspectives, right here and everywhere in academia and in involved groups. I think the essence of our discussion was, we're doing this gallery for 150,000 visitors, which we expect to come to our museum, who have not been involved, most of them, in this discussion. And still we want them to go out of the museum with an understanding that there is an issue, even in non-colonial Austria, with that colonialism still has sort of perpetrated into Austrian thinking as well. And so if that comes out, we've done what we wanted.
Barbara wanted to say something. I'd like to do two things in terms of my own challenges. I was just in Berlin to give a talk, and I was at the Deutsche Historische Museum, and they did an exhibition on colonialism. And one of the things that I found fascinating and important about that exhibition is that, one, it doesn't claim that there is no objects. It is absolutely jam-packed full of objects. And so the question is, one of the things that we always say as museums is that when it comes to difficult histories, there are no objects. I would like to challenge that. And so one of the things it's a project that we're actually putting forward shortly called Materializing Slavery and Colonialism, in the research center anyway, a project that I'd like to do. So that's one thing. I mean, one of the other things which is interesting, which is where we talk about the complexity, and I agree with the complexity. And Iris where's Iris? She's here? Ines, she was saying that last night because there were several comments in the books that I could read because despite my attempts, I don't read German. But so I read a few English comments. Several of them I spoke about one last night referring to Terfurien, hoping that Terfurien would do an honest job like this. But what Ines mentioned, and actually what many people mentioned to me in this talk, is that so many of the visitors over and over and over and over in the visitor book said, what about the good things? How are we going to... So we understand that complexity. We understand the entanglement. But I still want to ask the question, what is it so that you're saying because it is so complex then the museum doesn't take a position and just show complexity? Because in my experience, complexity is not understood very easily by visitors. So what is your role in taking a position, and is that so? I'd like to go with this. And I'd like to also ask the question about, which I find fascinating, it's sometimes a kind of historian's conversation, about entanglements, which Nick always emphasizes, is not always about things that you can, about facts. Entangled relationships are also something about those emotional messinesses of what happens as well. And so this appeal to facts, I wonder, is there something of the fact that you're going to tell? Or is it so that there is also a imaginative, emotional, complicit, all of those things that also is a part of this story than facts? And I don't know if there's an answer to that. Two more questions and we go for lunch.
Yeah, now a lot of what I wanted to say has been said already, but I think it's not so much about the facts, but it's how you read the facts and raise questions. And what we try to do in Vienna is to attach the idea of colonialism to objects in our collections and to the collection and ask different questions about them and look at these objects from a different point of view. And I think our museums it's an archive to speak about these themes, and I'm sure the Ruhr it's the same. So it depends just on which perspective you look at your objects. They are not just ethnographic objects, they're historic objects, and they can be objects of colonialism as well.
I think that's important, and I just wanted to mention something that just in the past week or so I've been trying to acquire for the museum, a historic bark cloth from the Cook Islands, probably from the 1840s, that has a painting of a Christian church on it. And so far as I'm aware, it's probably the earliest image of Christian architecture from the Pacific. And we are interested in it for various reasons, but I mean partly because it exemplifies the sense in which islanders appropriated things and made Christianity a focus for a new social imagination and a new set of identities and so forth. And so obviously if the museum includes things like that on display, as well as things like Benin pieces, that attempts to underwrite a more complex set of responses to the issues raised by colonial history.
Okay, Michael. Yes, Michael, your question.
I think probably most of the museums we work in have perhaps no collections of Western collections or very little. Do you think by including both historic and contemporary Western collections into the World War Ethnographic Museum can make it a more even playing field in terms of how we approach ourselves and the other and the interconnectedness of it?
Exactly. This is what the museum here does, and what we are also planning to do with inviting contemporary artists. It is the specific gift of an artist to add this layer of interpretation or new relation or emotion to the collection that suddenly explains in a poetic way, very fast. No, not fast, but poetically. Gives another layer that is the easiest way, but not to say that contemporary art is, being art is easy, but that is the easiest way to add that layer.
But I think to also go back to Michael, the last question from Anita, yeah? Michael, for example, the Tropen Museum, it would be hard to say we have no, I would say, our museum, hard to say we have no European collections. I would say it more complexly. We have a lot of collections emergent out of the colonial moment. We have a lot of collections that speaks to the lives of colonials living in the colonies. We have our colonials who moved here. So we actually have a lot of collections that speak to the not only over there, but us in that process. And so perhaps because the Tropen Museum had a different kind of genealogy as the Colonial Museum and what that meant. But I think that from that perspective, there are possibilities, I would say, to feature that entanglement. But I think also that with many ethnographic museums, for me anyway, I think that the collections are so implicated in those entanglements, whether or not they are the reverse side of the us. So without, what we've done very often is that we've always spoken about them rather than us in that making. And I think that that is important. Anita?
Yeah, I was just going to add, obviously the complexity, or the ways that we try to display the complexity of different colonial regimes in different times and different places is an extremely important and urgent question. But I'd also like to bring up, and particularly in the context of the last paper, Marcus's paper that we heard, of what goes on behind the scenes and about how we can decolonialize collections and actually develop less proprietorial and more productive ways of working with different people around the collections. And certainly at Cambridge and elsewhere, for over 20 years, we have had rituals go on behind the scenes with our collections. We have occasionally lent material out for use in rituals in different kinds of contexts, for artists to use historic collections in performance. And obviously this is at times very challenging. We're selective about how we do it, but we have found it to be extremely rewarding. So I just wanted to add that. What we do behind the scenes is extremely important as well.
I'd love to use that actually as a springboard to lunch. Also, for another reason, I would say that several years ago, when I first joined the Horniman, the staff of the Horniman Museum, and working with colleagues of mine, it was not necessarily easy to use the word colonial within the ethnographic museum. And I must admit that this is where my hopefulness comes, that it is an amazing thing, to be honest with you, just from my personal experience, that so many museums of ethnography and world cultures are actually suggesting today that they all will include colonialism in their narrative, that they are going to have rooms specially dedicated, or a question whether or not it will be throughout the entire museum. Because I remember having conversation with my colleagues who kept repeating over and over and over again, it is not all colonial. Why do you always mention that? So the question then is not necessarily whether or not the colonial will be attended to, but how might we do it? And what might it mean to think it in the present? And one of the things why I said Anita probably opens up the possibility is to think whether or not it is not only about the pastness of the colonial that we need to engage with, but rather in the present, starting from a process of the decolonial or decolonization, or how do we understand that tense battle that Nick is talking about when the students come over and say, we want to give it back. Can we get it back? Whether or not starting in that moment of contestation is not an opportunity, rather than hiding those contestations and using that as a way of moving back. I was amazed in the Berlin Museum, and this is my lack of history, to see the overlapping relationship between the project of Nazism and the project of the colonial. And once you saw that, then you recognize that it is hard for us to say we have no objects. Rather, we need to try and more productively think about how these things are interrelated and their afterlives.